Have you ever wondered why you have to try so hard just to be loved? Why do you feel the need to pursue, to take the initiative, to prove your worth to be noticed, chosen, or kept? In a world that glorifies action, where results and speed measure everything, many women learn to live in a state of constant effort, as if only by relentlessly initiating and chasing can they avoid being left behind. They believe that strength means safety, that being proactive is necessary, that pursuit is the only way to avoid losing what matters. But the more they chase, the more exhausted they become. The harder they try to hold on, the emptier they feel inside. A quiet paradox unfolds. What they desire most is often the very thing slipping away the fastest. The great psychologist Carl Jung believed that people do not lose themselves because they are weak, but because they live too long in roles that are not truly theirs. On the journey back to the authentic self, a woman does not need to become more perfect. She simply needs to reconnect with the archetypal feminine energy within her soft, profound, still, yet possessing a natural magnetism that does not require pursuit. So what caused women to drift away from this state? And how does natural attraction return when you stop chasing? In this video, I will share with you the invisible layers of feminine energy that make you naturally attractive without effort. Pay special attention to the final insight, because it is the key that guides you back to your most radiant self, where love comes to you, instead of you having to search for it. Number 1. Decoding. Feminine energy. Why? The more we chase, the further we move away from ourselves. Before talking about why people feel the need to chase, perhaps you and I need to pause for a moment to decode something that many people deeply misunderstand. Feminine energy. Because in recent years, this concept has appeared everywhere, yet it is often presented as a surface-level image, being gentler, softer, less proactive, and then naturally being loved. It sounds appealing, but if it stops there, feminine energy turns into just another role, more refined, perhaps, but still a performance. At a deeper level, feminine energy is not a behavior, nor is it a strategy to attract someone. It is an inner state. A state in which you do not need to move forward to prove your worth. You do not need to hold on, cling, or do anything extra to stay. You are present so fully that your presence alone carries weight, and because of that, it does not chase. But the problem is this: most of us have never truly lived in that state. We grow up with a very familiar belief: if we are not proactive, we will be left behind. If we do not try, do not show ourselves, do not hold on, everything will slip through our fingers. That belief is not wrong from a social survival standpoint. But when it seeps into our emotional and inner lives, it creates a quiet consequence. We learn to chase instead of learning how to stay with ourselves. I have heard many people say that they don't need much in love. They just want the other person to care a little, to text regularly, not to abandon them. It sounds modest, but if you look closely, this is not a small desire. It is a sign of someone who has grown accustomed to lowering their own needs just to avoid losing the feeling of being chosen. And each time that happens, they take one small step further away from themselves, without even realizing it. From the outside, everyone sees them as gentle, thoughtful, and considerate of others. But if you ask deeply enough, you will touch an old fear. If I am not like this, will I still be allowed to stay? And so, chasing does not require moving forward. It happens in silence, in the act of shrinking oneself to preserve a connection. Chasing is rarely loud. It is often very reasonable, very right, and that is precisely why it is dangerous. Because when chasing is disguised as beautiful, values, care, sacrifice, effort, it becomes hard to see what you are losing. You think you are building a relationship, but in reality, you are trading away your inner presence for a temporary sense of safety. At an even deeper level, chasing does not begin with love. It begins with the discomfort of being alone with oneself. When you are not safe enough to sit still in silence, in emptiness, in uncertainty, the ego looks for something outside to cling to. And nothing is easier to cling to than attention, response, or the feeling of being needed. At that point, chasing becomes a subtle survival reflex of the inner world. Carl Jung observed that when people are not connected to their deepest selves, they seek wholeness through others. In other words, when there is emptiness inside, we turn outward to fill it. And chasing is one of the most common ways of doing that, not because we are weak, but because we were never taught how to stay with ourselves when no one is responding. You can recognize this effect through very familiar sensations: the slight tightness in your chest while waiting for a message, the restlessness when the other person is silent longer than usual, the urge to explain yourself, to clarify, to keep the atmosphere okay, or the exhaustion that comes from constantly maintaining a pleasant, positive, understanding version of yourself. These signs do not mean you are loving the wrong way. They simply indicate that your nervous system is on alert, always preparing for the possibility of being abandoned. Over time, the cost of chasing begins to reveal itself. You can no longer hear your own emotions clearly. You are no longer sure what you truly want, or whether you are just trying to hold on to a relationship to avoid facing emptiness. You may be loved, but you are not yourself. And deeper still, you begin to believe that, to be chosen, you must do something, you must change, you must be better, you must be more suitable. This is where feminine energy, in the Jungian sense, becomes completely misunderstood. Femininity is not about trying to be more attractive. It does not operate through willpower. It emerges when you no longer use other people to stabilize your sense of self, when you are safe enough to remain with uncertainty, with not being chosen, with not receiving an immediate response. At that point, chasing naturally falls away, not because you are above it, but because you no longer need it. When someone is safe enough to stay with emptiness, with not knowing, with not being chosen, chasing is no longer necessary. Not because they have everything, but because they no longer use others to fill the inner void. Before moving on, I want to invite you to pause for a moment and ask yourself, honestly and slowly, in your recent relationships, are you trying to preserve the connection by sacrificing your own emotions? When silence appears, do you feel calm or panicked? Are you moving toward the other person out of love or out of fear of loss? And if no one responds, no one chooses you, can you remain with yourself? These questions are not meant to make you blame yourself. They are simply meant to help you begin to see the moment where chasing is born. Because only when you recognize why you are doing it can the journey back to true feminine energy truly begin. Number 2. The Jungian mechanism. If in the previous part you and I looked at the effects of chasing, then now it is time to go one layer deeper. What inside us is actually creating that behavior? Because no behavior appears at random. Every reaction has a psychological structure behind it, and in this case, it is the tense relationship between the ego and the inner feminine. Many people believe that feminine energy is something that can be trained through behavior. Being a little softer, slowing down a little, being a little less proactive. But the more you try to do it right, the more tense you become. The harder you try to maintain a feminine image, the further you drift from your original sense of naturalness. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are using the right tool at the wrong level. First, it is important to clarify something that is easily misunderstood. When we talk about the ego, we are not talking about selfishness or a bad ego. In Jungian psychology, the ego is simply the center of consciousness, the part that helps you orient yourself, make decisions, plan, and maintain a sense of control over life. Because of the ego, you can study, work, build relationships, and function in society. But precisely because of this role, the ego is always afraid of losing control. And when we speak of the inner feminine anima, we are not speaking about gender, but about the principle of receptivity, feeling, allowing, and generativity that exists within every human being. The anima does not operate through plans. It does not respond well to pressure. It appears when there is space, when there is no pushing, when you are not trying to become anything at all. This is the very point where the ego and the anima so often come into conflict, and it is right here that the conflict begins. When someone enters a relationship with a great deal of well-intentioned effort, a great deal of understanding, and a strong sense of how I should be, the ego is in control. It believes that if it does things well enough, skillfully enough, subtly enough, the connection will be secured. But the inner feminine does not respond to effort. It withdraws when it is pressured. Not because it is weak, but because its nature cannot tolerate control. The dominant emotional tone of those living in this conflict is rarely a dramatic tragedy. It is a very quiet kind of exhaustion, a subtle tension in the body that stretches from one day to the next. They are rarely fully relaxed. There is always a part of them that is monitoring. Monitoring whether what they said was okay. Monitoring how the other person reacted. Monitoring the state of the relationship. And when attention is constantly directed outward like this, the inner world gradually becomes a place that is rarely visited. Carl Jung once wrote a very sharp line: "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Psychological growth does not come from trying to become better, brighter, or more correct, but from directly facing the unconscious forces that are driving us. In this case, the darkness is not weakness, but the ego's fear of losing control. You can see this very clearly in everyday life. Some people cannot tolerate leaving things hanging. An unanswered message, an undefined relationship, an unclear feeling. All of it makes them restless. Not because they lack patience, but because their ego needs a solid structure to feel safe, and so they ask more questions, clarify more, define more. But the more they do this, the further they feel from the original sense of aliveness. Or some people prepare very carefully before every important interaction. They think in advance about what they will say, how they will react, and which side of themselves they will present. Everything makes sense, yet inside, there is a very familiar feeling, as if they are standing in front of a mirror, adjusting every detail, instead of truly stepping outside and living. In those moments, the ego is working very hard, but the anima has no space to appear. What is important to recognize here is not that you have done something wrong, but that you have used the wrong tool for the wrong level of experience. The ego is excellent at building, but it cannot create life. It can manage images, but it cannot generate natural attraction. And every time you use control to replace feeling, the inner feminine retreats one more step. There is a question worth asking yourself, not to answer immediately, but to listen to what arises inside. In the moments when you want to clarify, to maintain rhythm, to control a connection, what would happen if you did nothing at all? No extra messages, no explanations, no adjustments, just staying with the feeling. What do you fear most? Losing the other person, or having to face the emptiness within yourself? When someone begins to dare to stay with that question, a very small but important shift occurs. For the first time, the ego is not allowed to act immediately, and it is precisely this pause that creates space. Space for the body to speak, space for emotions to surface without being corrected, space for the inner feminine to breathe. The solution, if it can be called that, does not lie in learning more techniques to let go or attract. It lies in practicing the capacity not to intervene. This may sound simple, but it is a very great psychological skill. Each time you notice the urge to control, to feel safer, try doing the opposite. Pause, breathe, and allow the discomfort to exist without trying to fix it, not to endure it, but to listen. A very simple, very real practice is to notice your body in those moments. Is your chest tight? Are your shoulders tense? Is your breath shallow? Just notice, without changing anything. When attention returns to the body, the ego loses some of its power, and the anima begins to have a voice, not loud, not clear, but deeply real. When this process unfolds over time, you begin to notice something interesting. You do not become colder or more indifferent. You become less strained. You do not speak more, but your words carry more weight. You do not try to be attractive, yet your presence has depth, and others can feel it, even if they cannot name it. To close this section, I want you to remember one core truth. The inner feminine does not need to be created. It only needs to be allowed. And what most often blocks it is not a lack of understanding, but an ego that is too impatient for everything to feel okay right away. When the ego learns to step back, even just a little, feminine energy begins to return not as a strategy, but as a way of being. In the next part, we will look directly at the long-term cost of letting the ego take the wheel for too long, and why many people only truly stop chasing when both body and mind are already exhausted. But before moving on, if there is anything in this section that touched you, let it stay. There is no need to understand it right away. Just do not turn away. Number 3. When you chase, what is actually being transmitted? There is a truth that sounds very simple, yet becomes uncomfortable for many when truly touched. You do not attract what you say you want. You only attract the state you are living in every single day. You can say many correct things. You can understand very clearly what you deserve. But energy does not listen to words. It only responds to the inner state you are carrying. Chasing, on the energetic level, is not merely the act of moving toward someone. It is a quiet, inner state. A subtle tension exists behind every interaction. A wordless urgency, as if slowing down would cause everything to slip through your fingers. And even if you never say it out loud, even if you try to appear calm, your body and nervous system are still sending out a very clear signal. I am lacking, and I need to be filled. Carl Jung once said a line that becomes more deeply understood the longer one lives. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What you are not conscious of within yourself will quietly run your life, and then you will call it destiny. In this context, when the fear of abandonment, rejection, or not being enough is still active in the unconscious, it will shape the entirety of what you call love or opportunity. Many women are encouraged to plan their lives carefully. Clear goals, ideal future visions, and lists of achievements needed to become a better version of themselves. There is nothing wrong with that. But there is one thing they are rarely taught. Your inner energy is the true message that life responds to. Not desire, not effort, but your lived state. I once heard a woman share, in a very calm voice, that whenever she entered the early stages of a relationship, she lived in a state of heightened vigilance. Everything on the outside seemed fine. The other person texted regularly, showed appropriate care, and displayed no obvious signs of indifference. Yet inside, she was anything but calm. A single message read without a reply was enough to send her mind racing through countless scenarios. She began texting more, saying more, trying to maintain a normal atmosphere, while her body tensed, her heart raced, and her mind worked relentlessly to control the situation. What is striking is this: every time that happened, the relationship grew heavier, not because anyone was wrong, but because the energy of chasing had entered the space. The other person felt pressured, even though nothing was said explicitly. She felt unloved in the way she needed. They began to collide over very small things, yet no one named the real issue. And eventually, the relationship ended, leaving her with a familiar question. Why do I always end up in relationships like this? Numb. At its deepest level, chasing is always accompanied by a very old belief. If I do not do something, I will not be chosen. This belief does not appear out of nowhere. It is often formed very early, in periods when love and recognition came with conditions. When you were better, more obedient, more accomplished, you were seen. Gradually, you learn to equate your worth with achievement, effort, and pleasing others. And that pattern does not stop at work or school. It follows you into love. As long as this belief remains active, you will continue to attract situations that mirror it. People who do not choose you clearly. Relationships that require effort just to be maintained. Circumstances that force you to prove you deserve to stay. Not because you are unlucky, but because your unconscious is seeking opportunities to see itself. Jung called this phenomenon unconscious projection. When a part of you has not yet been acknowledged or healed, it will be projected onto the outer world in the form of people, situations, and repeating lessons. Not to punish you, but to force you to stop and ask, why does the same old feeling keep returning, only wearing a different face? From an energetic perspective, life does not respond to language. It responds to vibration. You may say you want a peaceful, respectful, unconditional relationship. But if the underlying state within you is still fear, distrust, and the urge to hold on, what you attract will be relationships that activate exactly those fears. Not because you are thinking incorrectly, but because you are living at a different frequency than what you desire. On the other hand, there are strange moments that many people have experienced, even if they cannot name them. Perhaps when you dared to leave a relationship you knew was no longer right, even though nothing new had appeared yet. Or a period when you were not searching for anything in particular, simply living more honestly with your own rhythm. And then, a person, an opportunity, or a new direction appeared so timely that it could not be explained by logic. Jung called this synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that occur when the inner state and the outer circumstances begin to resonate. What needs to be made very clear here is this: not chasing does not mean sitting still and waiting. This is one of the most common and dangerous misunderstandings about feminine energy. Life is not an entity that rewards those who merely wish. It does not respond to passivity. It responds to authenticity. Not chasing does not mean you do not act. It means you do not act from fear of lack. When a woman is truly aligned with her nature, her actions do not arise from an attempt to fill a void, but from a desire to grow, to learn, and to live in alignment with her values. If she longs for a respectful relationship, she learns to respect herself in small, daily choices. If she yearns for a free and creative career, she cultivates discipline, perseverance, and responsibility for the path she chooses. Not to be chosen, but because that is her truthful way of living. Feminine energy is not laziness disguised as self-love. It is not sitting back and waiting for life to change. It is acceptance deep enough to stop manipulating, combined with commitment strong enough to continue growing. When you stop acting out of fear of loss and begin acting from a desire to mature, something very natural happens. What no longer fits begins to fall away, and what is compatible begins to find you. Before we move on, I invite you to ask yourself, without needing to answer immediately, in your current major desires, what frequency are you living from? The frequency of lack or the frequency of growth? Are you doing what you do because you fear being left behind, or because you genuinely want to become that person? And if you were to stop chasing for a moment, what would rise up inside you first? These questions are not meant to create pressure. They simply open a door for you to see the truth operating beneath the surface. Because only when the inner frequency changes does the outer world have a reason to respond differently. And perhaps the most important thing Carl Jung wanted to leave you with in this section is not a conclusion, but a pause. A moment for you to realize that many things you once called love, opportunity, or destiny were, in fact, mirrors reflecting an inner state you had been carrying for far too long. Not to blame yourself, but to see clearly. If you continue to live at the frequency of lack, the world has no choice but to send you corresponding experiences. When you stop chasing, you are not giving up your desires. You are simply stopping the act of running away from yourself. And in that very moment, a subtle shift begins to occur. Not loudly, not in a cinematic, miraculous way, but enough for you to feel that you no longer have to strain yourself to be chosen. You are here, complete in your own quiet way. Before we continue, I invite you to ask yourself slowly and honestly, in the things you are currently longing for, how much comes from the fear of being left behind? And if you were to do nothing to hold on, what inside you would feel the most uncomfortable? Are you living to become someone worthy of love? Or are you learning how to love from where you are standing? If you feel ready, share in the comments a moment in your life when you realized that the more you released control, the more things began to fall into place. Your story might be the mirror someone else desperately needs while they are still trapped in the cycle of chasing. Before we move on, I want to pause for a moment to thank you for being here, for listening, and for walking with us halfway through this journey. Not everyone has the patience to stay with difficult questions, with uncomfortable truths about themselves, and the fact that you are still listening, still reflecting, is already a sign of inner courage. If what you have just heard resonated with you, take a moment to like and share this video. not to support us, but to give these reflections a chance to reach others who are exhausted from chasing, yet cannot name what is happening within them. Every share is a small movement, but one powerful enough to open a deeper conversation, much like the way Carl Jung's ideas have quietly spread through time. Thank you for being here. And in the next part, we will go deeper into the state of natural attraction, not as a promise, but as a very specific psychological outcome that emerges when you truly return to your own rhythm of living. Number 4. How the state of natural attraction is formed. When you begin to live and act from that inner energetic layer, not from lack, but from the growth of the soul, you start attracting what is aligned with you through your authentic frequency. When you stop trying to be attractive, you begin to be noticed more, not because you change your appearance, not because you learn new communication skills, but because your inner state has changed. You are no longer emitting the energy of lack, and when that disappears, a very natural pull begins to emerge. At its deepest level, attraction has never been an action. It is the consequence of being settled within yourself. When you no longer live and act from the fear of being left behind, but from the desire to live in rhythm with your inner world, the frequency you emit changes, and life, in a very quiet way, begins to respond. Some women only realize this after they are completely exhausted, too tired to maintain an image, too drained to please, too depleted to keep reading other people's emotions. They do not let go because they understand. They let go because they can no longer hold themselves together. And it is precisely in that phase, when they stop performing a pleasant version of themselves, that something very strange happens. They begin to be treated differently. Not always better right away, but more truthfully. Those who are not compatible withdraw on their own. The remaining connections become slower, but deeper. From a Jungian perspective, feminine essence is not a social role, but a living, energetic field of presence. It carries within it the capacity to receive, to nurture, to connect, and to create. When this energetic field is allowed to operate naturally, it is like a lighthouse. It does not call anyone in. It does not chase anyone. Yet it is bright enough to be seen. Carl Jung believed that the deepest archetypes of the psyche do not need to be activated through effort, but released from the layers of defense formed by fear. Yet many people learn to move away from this state very early on. No one teaches them how to stay with their true emotions. No one tells them that they can exist without constantly being pleasant, useful, or strong. And so they build subtle layers of protection. They still live, still love, still work, but there is always a part inside that remains tense, as if it must always be prepared for the possibility of rejection. Some people are used to always being the one who initiates texts, maintains connections, and asks questions. When they stop, it is not a strategy, but a desire to see what happens if they no longer hold on. At first, there is emptiness, discomfort, a feeling of doing something wrong. But after a while, they realize this. Relationships that existed only through their effort dissolve on their own. And in their place, new connections appear slower, fewer, but without the need to strain to keep them alive. Natural attraction is not something you create. It is something that is revealed when you stop hiding. A woman who lives fully in each moment, listens to her emotions, accepts even the imperfect parts of herself, does not need to do much to be noticed, because her presence carries a different rhythm. Slower, deeper, truer. Jung called the journey back to this essence individuation, not becoming better by social standards, but peeling away the roles that have been attached to the skin for too long. Many people only begin this journey when old definitions no longer work, when success no longer brings joy, when a relationship is fine but empty, when they begin to ask themselves, if all the familiar labels are gone, who am I? That moment often resembles a quiet crisis. You are not exactly sad, but you are disoriented. You no longer know where you are going. You are no longer certain what truly matters. Jung called this the night sea journey, the phase in which old structures collapse, allowing a more authentic self to take shape. For women, this is a silent revolution, because when a woman stops living according to a familiar image, she begins to unsettle the world around her. No longer always willing to sacrifice, no longer silent for the sake of harmony, and that causes many people to leave. But it is also at this moment that she begins to meet those who do not require her to shrink herself. Individuation is not the search for the best version of yourself. It is the removal of what is not you. It is realizing that the expectations you are living by may not be meant for you. The values you are protecting may not be nourishing you, and the things you once believed you needed may simply be fear in disguise. As the disowned parts are gradually acknowledged, a new wholeness forms. You no longer have to always be right, no longer always be good, no longer always be okay. You can be strong and fragile at the same time, clear and contradictory at the same time. And it is precisely this authenticity that creates an attraction no technique can replace. This change does not occur only psychologically, but energetically as well. When you stop chasing an idealized version of yourself, you begin to attract. Not because you want to, but because you are no longer blocking the natural flow. You can be alone without feeling empty. And from that state, what is aligned begins to find you. Natural attraction is not a miracle. It is the result of harmony. When you no longer manipulate the outer world to fill an inner void, life no longer needs to teach you through repeated lessons. You no longer have to search for love because you are no longer abandoning yourself. And perhaps that is the moment you realize what you once tried so hard to find outside only appears when you stay long enough with yourself. Number 5. Very small, but irreversible changes when you stop chasing. When you truly stop chasing, the world does not change immediately. The first thing that changes is always your inner rhythm. Very subtle, almost no one else notices. But you do. You begin to feel that you no longer have to react as quickly as before, no longer rush to reply, no longer feel anxious to clarify everything, no longer feel that if you slow down, everything will fall apart. At first, this change is not comfortable. At times, it can even leave you feeling unsettled, because when you stop chasing someone or an image, a space opens up. That space used to be filled with effort, with hope, with a familiar tension. And when it becomes empty, you are forced to stay with yourself more than you ever did before. Yet it is precisely from that space that very small shifts begin to take place. You begin to hear your body more clearly, not in a disciplined or controlling way, but in a noticing way. You notice your fatigue sooner. You notice when you no longer want to continue a conversation just to keep the peace. You notice evenings when you do not need anyone beside you, and yet you do not feel lonely. Your body no longer has to tense itself to adapt, and because of that, it begins to speak more honestly. At the same time, your emotional rhythm also changes. Not that you immediately feel happier, but that you deceive yourself less. You no longer try to convince yourself that something is fine when it clearly is not. You allow yourself to feel sad without having to explain it. You allow yourself to feel uncomfortable without needing to fix it right away. And when emotions are allowed to exist, they no longer need to explode or manipulate your behavior. This is a very small change, but it cannot be reversed. Because once you become accustomed to feeling before reacting, you cannot return to the old state, where everything had to be processed through logic, strategy, and doing things the right way. Another shift also happens, just as quietly. You begin to choose more naturally, not because you become more selective, but because you no longer have the energy to remain in connections that make you shrink. You do not need to cut things off dramatically. You simply stop stepping in. And strangely enough, what no longer fits falls away on its own, without requiring explanation or justification. When you stop chasing, you also stop trying to keep everyone. At first, this may frighten you, because for a long time, being loved, being needed, being chosen was tied to your sense of safety. But then, when you realize that you still exist, still breathe, still live even when you are not constantly chosen, a new belief begins to form. I do not disappear when I stop trying. This belief is crucial, because from it, you begin to set boundaries naturally, not as rigid declarations, but as healthy reflexes. You do not need to say no more often. You simply stop saying yes when your body is closing in on itself, and that is enough. Another change, deeper still, is how you see yourself. When you stop chasing an ideal version of who you should be, you begin to see your true self more clearly. Not always beautiful, not always pleasant. There are contradictions. There are unresolved parts. But instead of rushing to fix them, you begin to stay with them. And this act of staying transforms your entire relationship with yourself. Carl Jung emphasized that psychological maturity does not come from eliminating the undesirable parts, but from the capacity to hold opposing aspects within oneself. When you no longer chase becoming better, gentler, more attractive, you begin to become more whole. And wholeness, naturally, carries attraction. In everyday life, this shows up in very small details. You speak more slowly. You are silent without feeling the need to fill the space. You can be in a crowded room without having to prove your presence. You no longer try to impress. Yet, paradoxically, others feel you more easily. Not because you stand out, but because you are no longer scattered. Another very noticeable change is how you make choices. When you stop chasing, you no longer decide from the fear of loss. You do not choose because you are afraid of being wrong. You do not stay because you fear emptiness. You begin choosing from a very different question. Does this nourish me? And once that question appears, it changes the entire trajectory of your life. You may still do the same work, still be in the same relationship, but the way you are present within it has changed. You no longer strain to maintain it. You allow things to adjust or to end if they are no longer aligned. And that permission brings a sense of relief that is deeply real and profoundly human. These changes are not loud. No one applauds. There is no radiant moment of enlightenment, but they endure. Because once you have grown accustomed to not abandoning yourself, it becomes very difficult to return to old patterns. You may feel tired, you may feel uncertain, but you are no longer lost. And perhaps the most irreversible change of all is this. You stop believing that you need to become someone else to deserve love or a good life. Once that belief falls away, it does not return. You may still learn and grow, but no longer from a place of lack. You grow from within, instead of chasing outward. Stopping the chase does not take away your desires. It simply returns them to their rightful place, not as something meant to fill a void, but as a direction aligned with the person you are becoming. And from there, what comes to you no longer needs to be held tightly, because it arrives through resonance, not forced effort. If you are in this phase, you may not see anything amazing happening yet, but if you look closely, you will notice this. You are breathing more easily, sleeping more deeply, needing to convince yourself less. And those are not small changes. They are signs that you have crossed a threshold you cannot return from. You can share with us in the comments. Recently, what has begun to change since you stopped chasing? It might be a new feeling, a shift in a relationship, or simply a very small moment that made it impossible for you to go back to the way things were. We are here to listen without judgment, without rushing to conclusions, simply to reflect together and understand more clearly the path we are walking. Perhaps your story will touch someone else who is quietly moving through this same phase, just like you. And in the next part, we will move beyond theory. We will talk about how to live once you have stopped chasing, so that this state does not remain just a phase, but becomes a sustainable way of living deep enough that you no longer feel the need to search anymore. Number 6. How to live when you have stopped chasing. When you have truly stopped chasing, life does not suddenly become brighter or easier. It becomes more real, and it is precisely that reality that leaves many people unsettled. Because we are used to living in tension, used to always moving forward, used to becoming someone else to feel that we are on the right path. When all of those driving forces fall away, what remains is not emptiness, but a very unfamiliar kind of quiet. Living after you have stopped chasing first means slowing down, but not becoming passive. You no longer react hastily to every signal from the outside. A delayed message no longer sends you immediately into speculation. An invitation no longer forces you to calculate whether declining it will disappoint someone. You do not freeze. You simply wait for your body and your emotions to speak before you act. In this state, you begin living from the inside out, rather than from the outside in. That means you no longer ask, What should I do to be chosen? But shift to a very different question. Is this right for me? This question may sound simple, but once it appears, it quietly restructures your entire life. You begin choosing your work, your relationships, your pace of living, not based on whether they provide immediate safety, but on whether you still have to shrink yourself to stay within them. And what is striking is that you do not need to announce or explain these changes. They happen on their own, very quietly. Living after you have stopped chasing also means living with boundaries that are soft yet clear. You do not need to build high fences. You also do not need to constantly defend yourself. Boundaries now come not from fear of being violated, but from self-respect. You know when to stay and when to leave, and you no longer need to turn leaving into a battle. One very big change is the way you show up in relationships. You no longer love from a place of tension. You no longer love by trying to prove your worth. You no longer try to become a more lovable, more understanding, or good enough version of yourself to be kept. You love from your full presence. And if that presence is not received, you hurt, but you do not lose yourself. This completely changes the dynamics of love. You no longer attract people who require you to try hard to be chosen. You begin to meet people who stay because they want to, not because you are playing the role correctly. And even though the number of such relationships may be fewer, they carry a very different quality. Calmer, more real, and not exhausting. Living after you have stopped chasing also means that you no longer run from moments of not knowing. In the past, whenever uncertainty arose, you tended to fill the space with action, with plans, with doing something more. Now, you allow yourself not to know, not knowing what the next step is, not knowing where things will go, and you realize that not knowing is no longer as frightening as you once believed. Carl Jung once suggested that psychological maturity is not about having all the answers, but about the capacity to remain with questions without collapsing. When you stop chasing, you no longer force life to become clear on the ego's timetable. You allow what has not yet formed to have space to form. One very clear sign of this state is that you no longer feel the need to tell your story so much. You no longer feel compelled to explain why you chose this way, why you live like this. Not because you have closed yourself off, but because you no longer need validation to feel that you exist. Your silence now is not avoidance, but steadiness. Living after you have stopped chasing is also living with joy that does not need an audience. You can enjoy a slow afternoon, a cup of tea, a piece of music, a page of a book, without needing to share or record it. These moments may once have made you feel empty. Now, they become places where you recharge your life energy. You also begin to relate to sadness differently. You no longer rush to get past it. You no longer try to positivize every emotion. When sadness comes, you allow it to stay. And strangely enough, when it is not pushed away, sadness no longer needs to take root for long. It arrives, is felt, and then withdraws on its own. Another very important change is how you relate to success and self-development. When you have stopped chasing, you still grow, but no longer from a place of lack. You learn, work, and train not to prove your worth, but to express your true potential. This makes the pace of growth slower, but more sustainable. No more bursts followed by burnout. No more cycles of self-pressure, self-loathing, and self-doubt. Living this way does not make you numb or detached from the world. On the contrary, you become more sensitive, but not swept away. You can feel the energy of others without carrying it for them. You can empathize without dissolving, and that is a very mature form of femininity. Perhaps the biggest change of all is your relationship with yourself. You no longer see yourself as a project that must be constantly improved. You no longer live with the sense of being not enough. You still have days of doubt and moments of fatigue. But beneath it all is a new belief. I do not need to become someone else to be here. When you live from that belief, life begins to respond in ways that cannot be forced. Not always with what you once wanted, but often with what you truly need. The right opportunities, people, and turning points appear not because you chased them, but because you were standing in the right place. Stopping the chase does not make your life smaller. It makes your life more real. And once you have tasted that reality, It becomes very difficult to return to the old way of living, where everything had to be achieved, held tightly, and controlled. Living like this is not a destination, it is a way of being in life, a way of staying with yourself long enough that you no longer need to run. And when you are no longer running, you realize this: life was never turning its back on you. You were simply turning your back on yourself. Number 7. Practices for nourishing femininity. When living becomes a ritual. Individuation, as Jung emphasized, has never been a destination. It is not a moment when you are done with yourself, nor a perfect state to be maintained. It is a way of living, a process that unfolds every day, through each breath, each very small choice, each moment you decide to stay with yourself instead of turning away. Feminine energy is the same. It is not something you switch on when needed, nor something you possess like a skill. It needs to be continuously nourished through presence, through listening, through actions that seem ordinary, but touch directly into the deepest layers of the soul. And when you begin to live this way, life gradually becomes a series of rituals, not religious ones, but rituals of connection. The first practice, and the foundation for everything that follows, is returning to the body, not to improve your appearance, not to reach any standard of health, but to restore a long-broken relationship between you and your physical self. Many people live as if the body were merely a vehicle to carry the head from place to place. They think constantly, analyze endlessly, but rarely truly feel. When you set aside 10 or 15 minutes each day simply to sense your body walking slowly, breathing deeply, placing a hand on your chest and listening to your heartbeat, you are sending an important message to your nervous system. I am safe to be here, and only when the body feels safe can the inner feminine return. Not in an explosive way, but through a very gentle, very deep softening. Some people feel uncomfortable the first time they do this. They feel restless when there is nothing to do. They feel empty when they are not caught up in thought. But within that discomfort, a truth reveals itself: how quickly you have been accustomed to leaving your body. And when you stop running away, the body begins to remember its natural rhythm. Free movement, such as dancing according to emotion, is another way to awaken this. Not dancing to look beautiful, not following the correct beat, but letting the body lead. Feminine energy is water-like, flowing, bending, changing, not fixed. When you allow yourself to move this way, you are telling the unconscious, I do not need to control everything to exist. And from there, intuition begins to speak more clearly. The second practice takes place not in the body, but in the emotional world. Many intelligent, strong, independent women struggle here because they are accustomed to analyzing emotions rather than living with them. They explain why they are sad, why they are jealous, why they are hurt, but rarely allow those emotions to fully be present. Emotional journaling, in the Jungian sense, is not about fixing a problem, but about creating space for the unconscious to speak. When you write, "Today I feel jealous. I am hurt by that silence," you do not need to explain or justify. You only need to be honest. Emotions that are not acknowledged will find other ways to express themselves through clingy behavior, passive aggression, or withdrawal. But when written out, they begin to be released. Jung believed that the shadow is not dangerous because it is bad, but because it is rejected. When you dare to look at the less beautiful parts of yourself without self-condemnation, you are doing something deeply feminine, holding. And that capacity to hold is a profound source of strength. The third practice brings you to creativity, but not in the sense of achievement. Femininity is primal, creative energy. It needs no reason, no practical value. When you draw, sing, write, sculpt, cook, or do anything simply because you enjoy it, you are allowing that energy to flow. This is not about learning a new skill, but about remembering a very old state where you once did things purely for the joy of being alive. Carl Jung believed that the soul speaks through symbols, not concepts. When you draw a picture or write a passage without knowing where it will go, you are entering into direct dialogue with your unconscious. And in that dialogue, many long-buried parts begin to awaken. The fourth practice returns to something very basic yet often overlooked: nourishing the body. Not to control it, but to care for it as a sacred place. Sufficient, deep sleep is not only a biological need, but a psychological act. You are teaching yourself that you do not need to be tense to survive. Eating slowly, eating with presence, is a way of telling your body that it deserves to be listened to. When the body is properly nourished, something very important happens. Unconscious dependency decreases. You no longer need other people, work, or external attention to regulate your emotions. And from there, relationships begin to change not because you try, but because your inner foundation has shifted. A very deep part of femininity lives in the inner child. That child once lived fully, before learning shame, repression, or the need to be right. When you reconnect with moments from childhood, when you felt most free spinning, imagining, playing, you are not returning to the past. You are restoring a part of the self that was forgotten. Playful, emotionally rich activities without goals are not childish. They are medicine for a soul that has grown too accustomed to seriousness. When you allow that child to breathe again, you awaken the vivid, intuitive, and free woman you were born to be. The final practice, and the deepest one, is listening to dreams. Jung viewed dreams as direct messages from the deeper self to the conscious ego. Every image, every symbol, is a part waiting to be recognized. When you record a dream and feel into it rather than analyze it, you are learning the language of the unconscious, a very feminine language. Non-linear, image-rich, and intuitive. These practices do not change you overnight, but when you live with them long enough, a new form begins to emerge. Not a more perfect version, but a more real one. You no longer need to shine in the way the world expects. You begin to glow from within, in a very quiet, very personal way. And this is what Jung called individuation. Not victory, not achievement, but return. A return to yourself. No longer divided, no longer chasing, no longer running away. Just living deep enough that you no longer need to search. What about you? After moving through these practices, is there something in you that is beginning to slow down? Perhaps your pace of life is no longer as rushed. Perhaps you no longer push yourself to be okay all the time. Or perhaps you are beginning to realize that on some days, simply being with yourself is already enough. Many people once believed that nourishing femininity meant doing more, becoming gentler, better, more correct. But when they truly step into this journey, they realize that the greatest change lies not in doing, but in stopping the pressure to be strong when you are tired. Stopping the pressure to keep trying when something inside needs rest. Stopping the pressure to resemble a certain ideal to be loved. If you are in this phase, try sharing with us in the comments. Which of the practices above touched you most? Was it the moment you began listening to your body more closely? Or the first time you allowed an emotion to exist without rushing to fix it? Your story may be very small, but sometimes it is precisely those small experiences that open a door for someone else, a door they have never dared to look at. We believe that every inner journey has value when it is listened to, and sharing is not about proving how far you have gone, but about reminding one another that all of us are learning to live more slowly, more deeply, and more truthfully each day. If you are ready, leave a few lines below. Perhaps your story will become a gentle anchor for someone quietly walking this path just like you. Number 8. When you are no longer understood by everyone, and why that is a sign you are on the right path. When you no longer try to explain as much as you used to. When you no longer feel the need to respond immediately. When you no longer feel constricted when someone does not fully understand you. And then, one day, you suddenly realize that you are stepping out of conversations that once used to hold you in place. Not because you have become arrogant, not because you have grown cold, but because you no longer have the strength to keep living through familiar performances. You are not leaving anyone behind. You are simply no longer standing in the same place. And when you move, familiar gazes begin to fall out of rhythm. That feeling is difficult to name. It is not exactly a loss, But it is not complete peace either. It is like changing your inner tone of voice, while the world has not yet adjusted its ears to hear. You are still there, still yourself, but no longer understood in the old way. And it is precisely this moment, the moment when you are no longer fully understood, that becomes a very subtle sign that you are stepping out of roles and moving closer to yourself. You have done nothing wrong. You have not become distant. You are not intentionally withdrawing. Yet gradually, you notice that the way others look at you has changed. Fewer questions, less curiosity, less desire to pull you back into familiar roles. And within these silences, a vague feeling arises. I am no longer understood the way I used to be. At first, this feeling is easily mistaken for sadness. But if you listen closely, it is not quite pain. It is like stepping into a different room where the old sounds no longer echo. Not because you closed the door, but because you are no longer standing in the same place. When you begin to live differently, the first thing that breaks is not your relationships, but the fixed images of you in other people's minds. Before, they knew who you were because you always responded in familiar ways. You always explained, always clarified, always kept the peace, always showed up at the right moment to patch the gaps. These behaviors created a sense of safety for them, and when you stop doing so, that safety disappears. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when you begin to withdraw energy from the persona, the social mask you have worn long enough to be accepted. The persona was once necessary. It helped you integrate, survive, and be recognized. But when you no longer live from the persona, you break an invisible contract. The contract that says you will continue to be who they are familiar with. Carl Jung pointed out that when a person begins to move closer to the self, the true being, they often pass through a period of being misunderstood. Not because they are wrong, but because other people's reference frames have not yet adjusted. When you stop playing the role correctly, those who have only known you through that role may feel confused, even uncomfortable. And so the comments begin to appear, very lightly, very ordinary. You've been quieter lately. You seem different. You're not like you used to be. These remarks are not necessarily accusations. They are signs of something deeper. Others are trying to call you back to your old position so they do not have to adjust their way of seeing. At this stage, many people get stuck. They begin to wonder, am I being selfish? Should I soften again to make things easier? And if you return, if you begin explaining again, smoothing things over again, you will be understood once more. But the price is that you lose the truth you have just found. The hardest part here is not being misunderstood. It is losing the familiar sense of agreement. Before, you and the world shared a common rhythm. Even if you were tired, even if you were straining, you still felt that you belonged. Now, when you no longer shrink yourself to fit that rhythm, you enter a very different kind of loneliness. This is not loneliness from being abandoned. It is loneliness from no longer participating in false resonance. You no longer smile at the right moments, just to keep the atmosphere light. You no longer nod simply to avoid conflict. And when these habits fall away, silence becomes more visible. This silence does not stab, but it is empty. And within that emptiness, you begin to see yourself standing between two worlds. The old world, where you were understood, and the new world, where you no longer need to be understood by everyone. This phase often makes people want to turn back, not because they cannot bear the truth, but because they miss the feeling of being affirmed. Being understood once served as confirmation of your existence. And when that disappears, you are forced to learn a very difficult lesson: to exist without constant validation. When you stay with this state long enough, a deep shift occurs. You begin to realize that much of the being understood you once experienced did not come from others truly seeing you, but from you fitting yourself into their frame. And when you stop doing that, misunderstanding is not failure, it is a sign that you have stopped editing yourself. You also begin to see another truth. Not everyone who leaves when you change is a loss. Some relationships exist only because you are always agreeable, always accommodating, always present to maintain balance. When you stop playing that role, the relationship does not collapse because you are wrong, but because its foundation no longer exists. This does not mean you become indifferent or detached. On the contrary, you become clearer. You no longer need to prove whether you are good or bad. You allow others the right to understand you in whatever way they can, and in that letting go, you begin to feel lighter. One day, you realize that you no longer want to explain so much, not because you are tired, but because it no longer feels necessary. You no longer feel the need to convince anyone that your path is right. You no longer have to retell your story to be validated. Your silence now is not avoidance, but a very quiet steadiness. And then something else happens. When you stop trying to be understood, you begin to be met, not often, not loudly, but those who remain start to see you differently, not through roles, not through expectations. They meet you where you are, and encounters like these, though rare, carry a very different quality. They do not require you to shrink or exaggerate yourself. You can breathe within them. At this stage of life, you understand that no longer being understood by everyone is not a failure of communication, but a sign of inner maturity. You are no longer living to fit an old reference frame. You are creating a new one for yourself, and that frame does not need majority approval to have value. The question is no longer, why don't they understand me? It becomes, if I go back to who I was just to be understood, am I still respecting myself? When you can answer that question, many things settle. You stop rushing to conclusions about relationships. You stop labeling who is right or wrong. You simply see more clearly. What still resonates, stays. What requires you to shrink to exist, falls away. And in that falling away, a very steady sense of peace appears. You no longer need to be understood by everyone. You only need not to betray your own truth. When you stand firmly there, even in quiet moments, you know you are on the right path, not because the path is easy, but because it no longer asks you to abandon yourself. Perhaps, at some point, you will stop worrying about whether you are understood at all, not because you have become indifferent, but because you have touched a quieter truth. Your life no longer depends on other people's perceptions. You no longer feel the need to turn back whenever someone cannot keep up with your new rhythm of living. You also stop rushing to adjust yourself to fit other people's memories of who you were, not because you are right, but because you no longer want to break yourself into pieces just to be accepted. Carl Jung once said that a person truly matures only when they dare to live with their inner truth, even when that truth makes them feel out of place in the familiar world. And perhaps you are very close to that point. Not loudly, not with witnesses, just a very steady stillness. You will still have moments when you miss the feeling of being understood, agreed with, and held within the old circle of safety. But you will also realize that the price of that safety was slowly leaving you behind. And this time, you chose differently. Not to oppose the world, but to stop opposing yourself. If at times you find yourself moving more slowly than others, speaking less, remaining silent more often, try not to rush to correct it. Perhaps you are not falling behind. Perhaps you are moving into a deeper layer of yourself, one that does not need to be understood by everyone, only lived truthfully. And from that place, those who truly need to meet you will know how to find you, not because you call them in, but because you are finally standing in the right place. We grow up with the belief that if we are sincere enough, try hard enough, and love deeply enough, then life and relationships will naturally fall into place. That as long as we pursue the right person, remain patient long enough, and sacrifice enough, connection will arrive as a deserved reward. But reality is sometimes more complicated than that. Some relationships do not fall apart because of a lack of effort, but because there is too much effort coming from one side. Some connections seem deep on the surface, yet in truth exist only through quiet strain, where you are always the one moving forward, while the other remains still. And then, at some point, you become tired, not because you no longer love, but because you realize you have been away from yourself for too long in that pursuit. Feminine energy does not abandon you. It simply steps back, waiting for you to stop running so it can speak again. Because there are things that cannot be conquered by effort, cannot be held by worry, and cannot be nourished by fear. They only arrive when you are in the right state within yourself. Carl Jung once said, Who looks outside? Dreams. Who looks inside? Awakens. Perhaps what this journey is meant to remind you is not to abandon the outer world, but to turn back and look at the places where you lost yourself while trying to be loved, chosen, and recognized. When you stop pursuing, it is not because you have given up, but because you have awakened to a deeper truth. You do not need to become someone else to be worthy of what is healthy and sincere. If, in what has just been shared, you see yourself somewhere within the exhaustion of trying too hard, within the quiet moments of no longer being understood, or within the feeling of stepping out of an old loop, please remember this: you are not alone. You are simply returning to your rightful place. And from that place, attraction is no longer something you have to create, but something that naturally arises when you stop resisting yourself. If you found this content helpful and meaningful, please subscribe to the channel to continue walking with us in future videos about Carl Jung, depth psychology, and the journey of inner maturation. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss content created for those who are learning to live more slowly, more deeply, and more truthfully with themselves. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again at a place where you no longer need to pursue, yet are still fully able to attract what truly belongs to you.